Supermax prison conditions. Inside daily life in maximum security isolation. Viewer discretion advised. There's a place in America where silence isn't peaceful, it's punishment. Where doors don't slam, they seal. Where light doesn't brighten a room, it replaces the sun. Where a human being can spend 23 hours a day in a concrete box and never touch another person for years. Behind these walls, time loses meaning, voices fade, and the mind becomes the battlefield. Welcome to the most restrictive environments ever built in modern corrections, the Supermax. Not the prison you've heard about on the news. Not the one with bars, yard time, and cafeteria noise. This is different. This is total human isolation, designed intentionally, scientifically, and with extreme precision. And today, we're going inside. Because the public rarely sees what life actually looks like inside a facility built not to rehabilitate, but to contain the most controlled population in the country. If you think you know what solitary confinement is, you're about to learn why psychologists call these units the black sites of the brain. Stay with me, what you're about to hear is real, documented, and more disturbing than any crime story you've ever watched. This documentary is built on years of publicly available research. Bureau of Justice Statistics data. Dr. Terry Cooper's psychological studies. United Nations Human Rights findings. Vera Institute neurological research. And reports from former inmates and correctional staff across America. Today, we're unpacking daily life inside these facilities. The routines, the psychological toll, the design, the sound, the silence, and the reality of waking up every day in a world where movement is a privilege and conversation is a memory. What does life look like for the 20,000 plus people living under these conditions right now? Let's start with the moment the door closes. When the door locks. Imagine this. It's 6:12 a.m. Your eyes snap open, not because you slept well, but because the lights never turned fully off. You're in a room barely wider than your arm span. Concrete on every side. A metal toilet. A steel desk bolted to the wall. A bed that feels like punishment all by itself. There's no window to the outside world. Or if there is, it's the size of a shoebox and frosted so heavily it might as well be a painted brick. And there's nothing. Not a voice. Not a footstep. Just ventilation and your own breath bouncing off concrete. This is the starting point. This is the baseline. This is daily life for thousands of people in America's Supermax prisons. And the most intense part? This room is where you'll spend 23 hours today. The 23-hour day. It starts the same way, every single day. A tray slides through a metal slot in the door. No words. No eye contact. Just a sound, steel on steel, and breakfast appears like it was delivered by a machine. Time in a Supermax isn't measured by clocks. It's measured by doors. How many open? How many don't? Most don't. For the next several hours, you remain in the same spot, pacing, thinking, trying to keep your mind from sinking into the silence that surrounds you like water around a sinking ship. There's no conversation, no morning interaction, no decision to make, no place to go, just concrete and yourself. Some inmates describe this period as the part of the day where the mind starts echoing. Thoughts loop, memories distort, and the brain tries to fill the silence with anything it can create. Psychologists who study isolation say this is the exact moment the brain begins its adaptation response, a survival mechanism that activates when stimulation drops to near zero. But in here, this isn't a rare moment. This is the entire day. The move. When movement finally comes, it happens with absolute control. A voice from the intercom calls your number. You stand still. You turn. You place your hands behind your back. The door opens, slowly, mechanically, and 2 officers wait on the other side. You step out for the 1 hour you're allowed outside the cell. But outside doesn't mean open air or yard space. It means a small, enclosed pen, sometimes roofed, sometimes not, with walls so high the sky looks like a thin line pressed between concrete. Some facilities call this recreation. Others call it exercise. But the experience is the same. A walled-in box designed for movement without interaction, fresh air without freedom, sunlight without warmth. There are days when inmates describe this hour as the only moment that feels real, and days when it doesn't feel real at all. When the hour ends, the return is just as controlled as the release. Back into the room. Back into the stillness. Back into the environment that research shows can alter neural activity, emotional regulation, and cognitive function when experienced long-term. The door closes again. Silence returns. And the next 23 hours begin. The psychological walls. This is the part of daily life you never see in news reports or documentaries that only show the physical structure. The real walls in a Supermax aren't concrete. They're mental. Studies from the Vera Institute and peer-reviewed research from Dr. Terry Kupers show that the human brain reacts to prolonged isolation in measurable, predictable ways. Heightened stress. Distorted time perception. Increased sensitivity to sound. Difficulty focusing. Emotional flatness. Sudden waves of fear or agitation with no trigger at all. One former inmate described it as a place where your thoughts get louder than your voice. Another said the silence becomes so heavy that even remembering a normal conversation feels like recalling a dream. Inside these rooms, the mind tries to adapt. But adaptation comes with a cost. And this cost isn't temporary. Some effects linger long after release. Some never leave. The architecture of control. The cell isn't just a room. It's a system. Every angle, every material, every sound, or lack of sound, is engineered for one purpose: total control with minimal human contact. The walls are thick enough to swallow noise before it reaches the next cell. The door is solid steel with a narrow slot barely wide enough for a tray. The bed is a concrete platform or a steel frame that never moves. The lights are controlled externally. You don't choose when it's bright or when it dims. Even the air is regulated by a ventilation system built to remove any sense of natural connection to the outside world. In some facilities, the window is so narrow you can't see anything except light. In others, the glass is frosted or positioned so high that looking out becomes physically impossible. This design isn't accidental. It's a deliberate method of reducing stimulation to the absolute minimum. Architects of these facilities describe them as self-contained environments. But former inmates describe them as rooms where you forget what real life feels like. And over time, the environment begins shaping the mind more than the inmate shapes the environment. Human contact in a life without contact. One of the most documented realities of Supermax life is the absence of human connection. Not reduced. Not limited. Absence. Meals arrive through a slot. Communication with staff is brief and procedural. Recreation is alone. Movement is alone. Medical visits, mental health checks, and even showers happen under strict separation. For some inmates, the only voice they hear all day is their own. Psychological research shows that the human brain is wired for interaction, not optional, not nice to have, but essential. And when that interaction disappears, the brain begins creating substitutes. Whispers. Patterns. Imagined conversations. Memories replayed so many times they begin to distort. One study documented inmates speaking to insects in their cells just to feel connected to something alive. Others pace the floor for hours because movement becomes the only stimulation left. And this isn't fiction. This is documented in research, reports, and testimonies from people who lived years in these units. Isolation doesn't just remove people from society, it removes society from the mind. International scrutiny. In 2015, international investigators reviewed Supermax practices across the United States. What they found wasn't hidden, it was documented in official reports, policies, and statistics. Their conclusion was simple. Extended periods of isolation at this level may approach the thresholds identified in global human rights standards. The concern wasn't about how these places look, but about what prolonged deprivation does to the human mind. International guidelines warn that isolation beyond a certain point can create psychological suffering and may fall outside humane treatment standards. The U.S. correctional system has debated this for years, and the discussion continues today. Some argue Supermax conditions are necessary for safety. Others argue the psychological cost is too high. But all sides agree on one thing. The environment inside these units is unlike any other form of incarceration. And what happens inside doesn't stay inside. It follows people long after the doors open again. The night cycle. Night in a Supermax doesn't feel like night. The lights dim but rarely go fully dark. The facility hums with a constant mechanical heartbeat. Ventilation, electronics, automated locks. Sleep becomes shallow, fragmented, unpredictable. Some inmates sleep in bursts. Some barely sleep at all. Some develop patterns where the brain can't distinguish one night from the next. Time becomes a loop. The body becomes exhausted. The mind begins drifting into a space between waking and dreaming, a place psychologists call isolation-induced distortion. And when morning comes, it doesn't feel like a new day. It feels like the continuation of the same day that started weeks, months, or even years ago. When identity begins to fade. Inside a Supermax cell, identity isn't taken from you all at once. It slips away in pieces, slowly, quietly, without you noticing the moment it happens. The first thing to fade is the sense of time. Days blur, weeks dissolve, and months begin to feel identical. Without variation, routine becomes a fog, and memory becomes unreliable. Then the sense of self begins to thin out. Not because of punishment, but because there's nothing around you that reflects who you are. No conversations. No choices. No responsibilities. No interactions that remind you you're a person existing in a world where other people exist too. Psychologists who study long-term isolation call it self-disintegration, the point where the mind struggles to maintain the idea of me in a place where nothing changes and no one acknowledges your presence. Former inmates describe it in ways that repeat across interviews, states, and decades. I forgot how to act human. I felt like an outline of a person. I wasn't sure if I was getting quieter or if the world was. Identity needs feedback to stay sharp. But in a Supermax environment, there is no feedback. Only stillness. And in that stillness, the internal world can become louder than the external one. Sometimes comforting, sometimes terrifying, always consuming. The brain under pressure. Scientific studies show that the brain responds to isolation the same way it responds to extreme stress environments. Not metaphorically. Literally. Neurological research reveals measurable shifts. A reduced activity in regions responsible for emotional regulation. A difficulty processing stimulation after long periods of deprivation. Increased sensitivity to sudden sound or movement. Symptoms similar to those seen in individuals exposed to prolonged trauma. This isn't speculation. This is data. Brain imaging studies show that when human contact and sensory variation drop to near zero, the mind begins operating in a defensive mode, conserving energy, reducing responsiveness, and increasing internal focus. In other words, the brain starts shutting doors to protect itself. But those same doors are difficult to reopen later. Some inmates report panic when they re-enter normal environments. Too much noise, too many people, too many variables. Others describe feeling numb, detached, or overwhelmed, even in calm settings. The isolation doesn't just affect behavior during confinement. It alters the mind's wiring long after the term ends. The routine that doesn't change. One of the most difficult aspects of Supermax life is the repetition that never breaks. Every day follows the same pattern. Wake up in the same position. Stare at the same walls. Eat the same meals. Take the same steps in the same limited space. Spend the same hour in the recreation pen. Return to the same silence. End the day exactly where it began. There are no unexpected events. No spontaneous conversations. No sensory surprises. No natural transitions that signal a day has meaning or closure. The sameness becomes its own psychological pressure. Not intense like fear, but heavy like weight. Former inmates describe it as living inside a copy of yesterday. And when every day feels like yesterday, the mind stops looking forward. It stops marking time. It stops anticipating anything at all. This is where isolation becomes more than a condition. It becomes a world with its own rules, its own gravity, and its own version of reality. The body in captivity. While the mind changes, the body does too. Short, restricted movement alters sleep cycles. Low light and limited sun exposure affect circadian rhythm. Stress hormones rise. Muscle tone weakens. Natural energy patterns flatten out. Some inmates describe feeling physically older than they are, stiff joints, low endurance, constant fatigue. Medical research supports this. Long-term inactivity and chronic stress create physical effects similar to premature aging. Even simple actions like stretching your arms fully or taking several consecutive steps without turning become unfamiliar. In a place where movement is controlled by rules, the body eventually conforms to the environment, just as the mind does. The long distance to the outside world. Communication in a Supermax is not impossible, but it is narrow, delayed, and heavily structured. Mail arrives slowly, sometimes taking weeks to reach the sender. Outgoing letters go through strict screening. Phone calls are limited, monitored, and often scheduled far apart. In-person visits, when allowed, take place behind glass, through a handset, with no physical contact at all. For many inmates, the outside world begins to feel like a place that exists in memory rather than reality. A letter becomes an event. A phone call becomes a milestone. A birthday, a holiday, a family moment, all experienced as echoes that arrive long after they happened. When you cannot touch someone, cannot hug someone, cannot sit across from someone, connection becomes fragile. And when communication fades, identity fades with it. Because part of who you are is shaped by the relationships you maintain. In isolation, those relationships stretch until they feel thin enough to break. The more distant the world becomes, the harder it is to imagine returning to it. The silence that doesn't stay silent. Supermax prisons are quiet, but not in a peaceful way. The silence here is sharp, dense, and heavy. It doesn't relax the mind, it presses on it. In the absence of conversation, noise takes new meaning. A footstep in the hallway becomes a signal. A distant door closing becomes a disruption. A cough from another cell becomes a reminder that someone else exists. But most of the time, there is nothing. No voices. No human rhythm. Just the hum of ventilation and the static emptiness that fills a concrete room. Eventually, the silence starts to sound different. Some inmates report ringing in their ears. Others hear faint murmurs or patterns that aren't really there, the brain creating stimulation where none exists. This isn't imagination. This is a documented neurological response to prolonged sensory deprivation. The human mind is not built for silence that never ends. It tries to escape it, fill it, shape it, any attempt to keep itself from sinking deeper into the void. Because in the absence of sound, the mind becomes louder than the world. Holding on to reality. Not everyone in a Supermax breaks. But everyone adapts. Some inmates create strict routines, counting steps, organizing items, timing breathing exercises, anything that gives structure to a day that has none. Others turn inward, relying on memories, imagination, or writing to stay mentally connected to something outside the cell. Some find strength in faith or philosophy. Some in mental endurance. Some in the hope of eventual change. But everyone faces the same challenge. How do you stay yourself in a place designed to strip away everything that reminds you who you are? It's a question with no universal answer. But research shows that those who maintain even the smallest mental anchor, a purpose, a goal, a memory, a voice, fare better than those who lose themselves completely to the environment. Survival in a Supermax is not physical. It's mental. It's emotional. It's psychological. It's the struggle to hold on to pieces of identity while the environment pushes against them day after day. The clock that doesn't move. Time inside a Supermax doesn't feel linear. Hours stretch. Days loop. Months feel identical. Years can slip by almost unnoticed. Without natural markers, conversations, tasks, responsibilities, sunlight, social rhythm, time stops behaving the way it does in the outside world. Some inmates describe feeling like they aged mentally but not emotionally. Others feel stuck at the age they were when they entered. Some lose track of the calendar completely. And when time loses meaning, so does progress. Finishing a sentence becomes an abstract idea. Release feels distant and unreal. The future becomes a faint outline instead of a destination. The psychological impact is subtle but powerful. The human mind needs time to move in order to feel alive. When time stops, a part of the person stops with it. The weight of years. The longer someone stays in isolation, the heavier the environment becomes. The silence deepens. Thoughts sharpen. Emotions flatten. The brain learns to live with less stimulation and forgets how to handle more. This is why many former inmates struggle when they re-enter normal settings. Noise feels overwhelming. Movement feels chaotic. Being around people feels unnatural or frightening. Even positive interactions, family gatherings, greetings, conversations, can feel too intense. The human mind adjusts to whatever reality it's placed in, but it doesn't always know how to adjust back. Years in isolation don't just take time from a person, they change the way the mind interprets the world. And the longer the stay, the deeper the imprint. A system under debate. Supermax prisons were built to manage the most dangerous individuals in the correctional system. But the debate over their psychological impact has grown louder over the years. Experts argue about safety, necessity, mental health, human rights, and long-term consequences. Some states have begun reforming their use of long-term isolation. Others continue operating with the same structure they've had for decades. But the facts remain. More than 20,000 people in America live under some form of restrictive housing. Many in conditions that research shows can alter the mind. All within facilities built on the belief that security requires separation. Whether these environments protect or harm, or do both, remains one of the most contested questions in modern corrections. What cannot be denied is the impact. The environment inside these walls leaves a mark. On the mind, on behavior, on identity, on life after release, and on the ongoing debate about how far a system should go in the name of control. The hidden routines of control. Behind the steel doors and reinforced glass, there is a world the public rarely sees. The daily choreography that officers perform to keep the most volatile environment in America from exploding. Every movement inside a Supermax is calculated. Every step is intentional. And every routine is built around one mission: control without confrontation. Before dawn, staff meet in a secured briefing room, a space where silence feels heavier than the concrete around it. Here, they review inmate behavior patterns, escalating tensions, coded messages intercepted from cells, and any unusual activity from the previous night. They don't describe inmates by name. They describe them by risk, history, and behavior probability. They track micro-behaviors most people would overlook. A man pacing 1 hour longer than usual. A refusal of a standard meal. An inmate who suddenly stops asking for anything. A shift in the way someone folds their bedsheet. To them, these aren't quirks. These are signals. Signals that something is coming. This hidden routine, quiet, methodical, almost clinical, is the backbone of Supermax stability. Without it, one unpredictable moment could cascade into chaos. The invisible system that runs the prison. Supermax prisons aren't held together by walls and locks alone. They run on a network of unseen systems designed to manage human behavior without direct physical contact. This system is built on 3 pillars. 1. Separation. No inmate is allowed to get physically close enough to influence another. Communication is filtered. Movement is isolated. Information flow is controlled like a dangerous substance. 2. Schedule rigidity. Every task, from showers to meals to medication, runs like a machine. A 1-minute delay isn't just inefficient, it's dangerous. Predictability is a weapon against unpredictability. 3. Behavioral economics of control. Small privileges become powerful currency. Radio. An hour of rec time. Clean clothing. A hot meal instead of a cold tray. These are micro-incentives that shape compliance more effectively than force ever could. This invisible system is not loud. It doesn't look dramatic. But it is the single reason a Supermax functions without imploding under its own pressure. How daily life changes a human being. Now comes the part few ever talk about, the long-term psychological imprint this environment leaves on the human mind. Because after months, years, even decades in Supermax conditions, daily life stops being a routine. It becomes identity. A person who wakes up alone, showers alone, eats alone, and speaks to no one eventually begins to adapt to that silence. At first, it crushes them. Then it reshapes them. Some develop intense hyper-awareness, able to hear a guard's footsteps before they reach the block. Some lose the ability to read facial expressions, because they haven't seen any. Some grow dependent on structure, unable to function without strict rules. Others disconnect from time altogether. And when the door finally opens for release or transfer, the outside world doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like chaos. Because after living in a place built on control, the absence of control becomes terrifying. Supermax routines don't just manage daily behavior. They sculpt long-term outcomes, sometimes permanently. The human cost. After everything, the silence, the repetition, the stripped identity, the invisible systems of control, there is one undeniable truth. Supermax confinement leaves a mark. Not just on the body, but on the mind, on emotions, on perception itself. Psychologists describe it as a profound alteration of thought patterns. Former inmates describe it as a slow erosion of what it means to feel normal. Even short stays can cause anxiety, hypervigilance, and emotional numbness. Long-term isolation leaves scars that last decades. It's a system designed to keep people contained. And it succeeds. But in doing so, it challenges every principle of what we consider humane treatment. This is why debates rage over its continued use. Safety and control are essential in corrections. But at what cost to the mind, to identity, and to the future of those who return to society? Lessons from behind the walls. There are lessons embedded in the silence of Supermax life. Lessons about human endurance, psychology, and society. Isolation reshapes the mind. Even a few months of extreme isolation can alter perception, emotional regulation, and cognitive function. Routine becomes identity. The human brain adapts to repetition, but sometimes too well, creating patterns that persist long after confinement ends. Connection is essential. The absence of meaningful interaction affects mental health more than the presence of concrete walls or metal doors. Systems of control have consequences. Every design, schedule, and rule in a Supermax is intentional, but each one leaves a psychological imprint that can last a lifetime. Understanding these realities isn't just about prisons, it's about understanding the human mind under extreme stress and the ethical limits of control. The Supermax isn't just a building. It's a mirror of extremes. It shows what happens when safety, control, and isolation collide with human vulnerability. And it challenges us to ask uncomfortable questions. How much control is too much? How far should a society go in the name of security? And how do we balance punishment with humanity? If this documentary leaves you thinking, reflecting, or even questioning, then it has done its job. Because understanding life inside these walls is the first step toward understanding the limits of the human mind and the cost of confinement. If this story made you rethink what incarceration means, subscribe for more research-based documentaries exploring the human side of prisons, crime, and justice. Comment below what shocked you the most, and share to start a conversation about what humane treatment really looks like.